Authorities are expecting more than 2 billion passenger trips to be made across China during the 40-day Spring Festival travel rush this year.
2023年春运从1月7号开始到2月15号结束，共40天。
12号春运第6天，全国铁路预计发送旅客685万人次，客流集中的长三角地区同比增长14.1%。
So, China's 40-day Spring Festival travel rush has entered its second week, and nationwide passenger traffic continues to grow.
The data also shows that 55% of the passengers are going back to hometowns.
进入春运以来，铁路客运量及货运量持续增长。
开始检票，有乘坐乘6999
It's January 2023, and the biggest migration of humans on the planet is back in full swing. Over the next 40 days, this railway station in southern China will witness the arrival and departure of over 15 million people. It's a journey that many have yearned for, a Chinese New Year family reunion.
疫情情况确实不方便，就3年没回去了。
3年没回去啦。
我觉得能回去就是一个礼物吧。
现在疫情解封了，开心。
其实国家把我们保护得很好，
很开心啊！开放了。
蔡叔，我是小峰啊。没事了啊。
However, 25 kilometers away from the railway station, at the first affiliated hospital of Sun Yat-sen University, it's a very different story. Here, in one of China's largest and best-equipped ICUs, every bed is occupied.
就是激励还是不是很好。
Dr. Wu Jianfeng and his colleagues work around the clock, treating 200 critically ill COVID-19 patients, most of them in their 80s.
你现在好了呀，你怎么会见不到他呢？
回病房了，回家见，可以回家见了啊。
我们说了，约好了，我们跟你过100岁生日的呀，对不对？你离100岁还有10年呢。
我一有意等的是等到现在，等现在没家一样。
哎呀，不会，你还可以见至少10年以上的啊。但是我们这个病区来看啊，现在已经收了40多例吧，大概已经转出了20多例了嘛，对吧？那还有残余量，现在很多都是在慢慢好转。我们 ICU 是生命重生的地方，就是说他要。我们是让他活，对吧？要让病人活。
7号发布的进一步优化落实新冠肺炎疫情防控的10条措施，
要求不按行政区域开展全员核酸检测，
还有除特殊场所之外，不查验健康码，
也不再开展落地检，最大限度的减少疫情对经济社会发展的影响。
On December 7th, 2022, China rolled out 10 new measures aimed at optimizing epidemic prevention and control. In particular, COVID-19 patients would no longer be sent to quarantine. For the first time in almost 3 years, there was no mention of the dynamic zero COVID policy.
例如，无症状和轻型病例以后可以居家了，
不得采取各种形式的临时封控，不得停工、停产、停业等。
A sea change was taking place in China's COVID-19 policy. Predictably, however, while the restrictions were easing, COVID-19 cases were on the up. In Beijing, medical workers found themselves under huge pressure to contain the rising tide.
就10月7号之前，门诊量大概就不到30个病人，8号就开始多了。你看，8号早上交班，总数就81个，发热79个，然后9号322个。我12月10号那天上班，就是周六嘛，就将近400多了。
到4。
就你们2个人是吗？
就我们老伴儿，没人。
我是站不起来了，
这发烧呢，
腰酸的不行了，腿也酸。
第一波挑战应该还是医护人员自身的感染，所以说我们从12月11号，我们的医护人员开始第一批有人感染了，然后在短短的2周之内吧，应该几乎所有的医护人员都发生了这个感染，在12月中旬左右的时候所以那个时候大家是感到最艰苦最辛苦所以很多医护人员一边在咳嗽，有发低烧的，然后一边给病人在救治。
Intensive care units, together with emergency and fever clinics, were now on the front line in the battle against the rising COVID tide. Before long, fever clinics across China were treating nearly 3 million patients a day, while emergency departments were taking in 1.5 million. Less than 3 years earlier, Xun Yan, an emergency room veteran with 25 years' experience, had been to Serbia to aid that country's fight against the virus.
现在在这个地方看到的这些情形，已经比10天前好多了。
By mid-January, it was service as normal in her emergency room, and the Chinese government could declare that the nationwide COVID peak had passed.
全国和各省已经度过了3个高峰，这3个高峰就是全国各省的发热门诊高峰、急诊高峰和重症患者的这个高峰都已经度过。那么全国发热门诊诊室的就诊人数在2022年12月23日达到峰值，之后呢是持续下降，到1月17日较峰值下降了94%。
Online searches for fever, positive, cough, and other keywords related to COVID-19 and its symptoms also peaked in mid to late December. For Wu Jianfeng, the situation brought back memories of what had happened 3 years earlier. On the eve of Spring Festival 2020, Wu arrived in Wuhan, which was being devastated by a terrifying, unknown killer. He was among the first medical personnel sent to assist the city in its battle against the disease.
我1月24号当时接到通知，然后就是2个小时之后接通知，晚上必须出发，然后就去医院去集合了，然后就开始坐飞机，凌晨的飞机到达武汉。我记得还非常清楚，应该是凌晨3点钟左右。
The novel coronavirus that appeared in Wuhan in 2019 was far more virulent and lethal than the current Omicron strain. Back then, the 60,000 medical workers in Wuhan were stretched to breaking point.
开始的时候，我跟他们一样也是失眠，你只要睡着，你就梦里面就全部是这些患者的那些影像在你大脑里面。
这单元里面是最重的病人抢救的病人都是有气管插管
只要一张床空出来了，哪怕是那个床上的遗体还没抬走，就已经开始人来预定这个床位了，就到这样的程度。
Then, on January 20th, the new coronavirus was recognized as an infection on par with bubonic plague and cholera, triggering mechanisms mandating mass quarantine under the Chinese law. This remained the situation for the next 3 years.
把它列为法定报告传染病一类，按强烈管理，它就给武汉封城提供了一个法律基础。
Also on January 20th, Chinese President Xi Jinping issued a series of instructions regarding the battle against the novel coronavirus. He said that people's lives and health were the priority, and that the efforts to contain the spread of the virus should be resolute and unstinting. He also stressed the importance of prompt information sharing and enhanced international cooperation.
自2020年1月23号10点起，全市城市公交、地铁、轮渡、长途客运暂停。
The rest is history. Wuhan was put under lockdown. 10 million people were in the city. Such a move was unprecedented. To help Wuhan, the whole country was mobilized. Urgent supplies and more than 42,000 medical workers from all across China were rushed into the beleaguered city.
养兵千日，用兵一时，回来不如显身手。
我们要提前的预判，打出一部分提前量来，然后呢，能够保证它快速的这个调动。我觉得这些其实都是非常。另外就是我们国家的一个制度的优势和体制的优势了。就我们国家是公立院主体的，就是公立院是主体的话，我们可以随时的来调派这些医院。
每一个医护人员心里都会有这样的担忧，对吧？就是担忧在这个治疗过程中间，对吧？有没有可能会被感染？个人的看法就是什么？就是说，把这个更多的是一种责任，我觉得应该是这样。救治病人，救治重症病人，那就是我们该做的事情。如果这个事情我不做，那我说句不好听话，那我连吃饭的这个资本都没有了，对吧？
But even China's finest medical minds seemed helpless in the face of this unknown enemy.
我们那会儿去武汉，还真是不了解这个，一点都不了解，不知道这个病毒是什么特点，也不知道它会在武汉那么厉害。就是大家可能对武汉记忆很深刻，病人都很重，都是比较严重的呼吸衰竭，都要上呼吸机，都要上 ECMO， 这个比例是很高的。
At the beginning of 2020, China, a country of 1.4 billion people, had just 63,000 ICU beds. The danger was obvious. If the virus got a grip countrywide, the whole medical system might collapse in a short time. The tragedy of Wuhan would be repeated all across China. But thanks to China's rigorous COVID policies, a national disaster was averted. Meanwhile, doctors were accumulating experience in combating the virus. And the authorities issued a series of protocols and treatment plans as the virus evolved and new variants appeared.
我觉得从临床治疗到临床救治起来，难度肯定比武汉小得多。我们压力没那么大。这个奥密克戎它的特点就是传染性强。 传播力强，就是一传好多人阳性了。实际上，真正需要去住院或者需要住在 ICU 的这个比例还是低。大概我也统计了一下，比方说我这2家定点医院，就是我把它重性和危重性都算上，占到3%到4%。
还是现在比之前呢，还是要准备的要充分很多。一个是物资充分，一个心理对他没有不像以前的一种恐惧感啊，对他的认识更加的深刻。 治疗了解更加的深入，还有一个就是中国的这一种救治的理念，可能跟国外有时候也不太一样。因为国外他们80岁的时候，很多人就不插管了，对吧？但是中国不会，就我们仍然是生命至上、人民至上，对吧？只要有一些机会，我们仍然会尽全力去救治。
In addition to improving diagnosis and treatment, increasing the number of ICU beds was vital. In the 3 years since the COVID-19 outbreak, China has added nearly 120,000 ICU beds. The number of ICU doctors has increased by nearly a third, and that of ICU nurses has doubled. In 2022 alone, the number of ICU beds increased by over 110,000. In less than a year, ICU beds per 100,000 people in China surpassed that of developed countries such as Britain, Japan, Spain, and France.
现在大家还是觉得，就虽然你们做了准备，但是大家现在也没觉得准备是充足的。
不论是北美还是欧洲，当一个疫情的高峰来的时候，都会或多或少的在一段的时间内 出现一定程度的医疗资源的挤兑，在这个资源相对紧张的情况下，采取什么样的措施来确定优先的救治对象，来实行分级诊疗，来真正使一些高危的这些人群作为最优先的人群，及时的得到救治。
3 years ago in Wuhan, lack of oxygen was a big problem. That's why in Xunyan's ER, oxygen inhalation outlets are now installed on every wall. That way, there will be enough oxygen for all the patients who require it.
以前我们这就只是墙壁，全是都可以满足吸氧。你看这边很多新冠的病人，你看这还有吹这个氧气的，吹这个高流量吸氧的。你看年龄
还是老年人多，
但是没有刚刚开始那么多老年人了。我有一天查房，就在这一间房里面，都有4个100岁老人。
4个100岁老人。
对。
Her experience has also highlighted the importance of something that's proved vital in the fight against COVID: vaccination.
就是打了疫苗的那些，确实，你去看来住到这里的那些的话，你问他好的是没打疫苗的。打了疫苗的这些患者当中的话呢，就是来到急诊室之后，你能看到他的这个病情啊，就是能好转的。不至于一来就呈现出那种危重症马上要插管那样子的这种情形的话呢，会要少一些。即使是插管之后，他能被救治成功的机会也大一些。
通过这3年啊，给我们应该是提供了3个非常关键的窗口期。第一个疫苗，就我们的全民的这种接种率啊，达到了一个非常高的一个水平。第二个呢，就是病毒的最初的它的这种致病力啊非常高啊，到现在的这种致病力的逐渐的下降。第3个非常关键的问题，我觉得就是药物的研发。那现在大家国外啊，这个包括我们国家啊，都有一些针对新冠的这种小分子的这种抗病毒的药物。我想通过这3年，大大的提升了我们的医疗救治能力和针对这种突发公共卫生事件的这种应急这种处置的这种能力。
As of the end of 2022, China had administered over 3.46 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccine. Now, more than 90% of the population are fully vaccinated. Of those over the age of 60, nearly 91% have received a vaccine. In all, 180 million elderly people have been given a booster shot. But vaccinating a population of 1.4 billion was no easy matter. Many people had been reluctant to take a shot.
但很多中国人对新冠病毒死亡威胁的感知，在当时并不是十分的强烈。因为据 WHO 的数据显示，在2021年，新冠肺炎导致的死亡人数的话，接近350万人。从武汉疫情之后到2021年全年，中国因为新冠病毒所导致的死亡人数非常的少。
The public lacked a sense of urgency about getting vaccinated, which was not surprising at the time. According to official data, in the whole of 2021, COVID-19 caused only 2 deaths in China. In April 2021, CGTN conducted a street survey.
我觉得大家如果疫苗普及了，反而我是安全的，我就不用打了。
出租车司机啊、警察他们都打过了，那我觉得没什么问题。
我所认识的人，他们都打疫苗了。
还没。因为其实我们也很少会出门嘛。
我今天本来都做好准备了，但是还得要预约，是吧？我得办一件事儿，然后再预约再说。这肯定做，您放心。
就是没有这个紧迫感，感觉国内的疫情还是挺好的。
Out of the 19 people we interviewed, 11 had not been vaccinated. From the very beginning, CGTN has tracked the progress of China's vaccination campaign, from the initial R&D to the actual shot in the arm. This is the Institute for Viral Disease Control and Prevention, the place where the development of a Chinese vaccine began. Here, on January 7th, 2020, Chinese scientists, for the first time, captured the culprit of the pandemic under an electron microscope. A typical coronal-shaped virus with a crown of outer particles. Minute, invisible to the naked eye, it takes the all-seeing power of an electron microscope to force this silent killer to reveal itself. A sphere with a distinctive halo of spikes.
拍到世界上第一张的电镜照片，病毒呈现了典型的冠状病毒的形态。
我们第一步的工作就是要开展这个样本的一个检测跟病毒分离，我们才有可能验证这个病源。
能看到这个颗粒，这说明我们的病毒分离是成功的，
才能开展后面的疫苗和药物的研发。
On January 10th, Chinese scientists shared the gene sequencing of the virus with the world.
这种共享就为各国就说这个研究吧或预防控制赢得了时间。
Based on the information shared by China, the United States quickly began work on developing its first mRNA vaccine. Around the world, scientists responded with unprecedented speed and urgency. In China, 5 technological routes were simultaneously launched for vaccine research and development.
第一条灭活，第二条蛋白，第三条腺病毒为载体的疫苗，第四条流感病毒为载体的疫苗，最后一条就是 mRNA.
On March 16th, 2020, a medical team in Wuhan became the first research group in the world to begin clinical trials of a vaccine.
然后自己本身也是武汉人，因为之前看到新闻就觉得自己挺无能为力的，然后这次看到那个志愿者招募，我想着自己一定要报名尽一份力。接种的整个过程当中，其实没有过多的一些什么害怕呀或者担心，反而觉得挺兴奋的。兴奋的是看到了希望，那的医护人员啊都特别耐心，态度也特别好。 然后当时就觉得心里很安心，看着他们，我没有别的愿望，就是唯一的愿望就还是希望武汉能够快点好起来。
But there was a snag. With the epidemic well contained in China, it was proving difficult for the R&D teams to find enough clinical volunteers to yield worthwhile data. So, they started to look overseas. On June 23, 2020, the Phase 3 clinical trial of a Sinopharm vaccine began in the United Arab Emirates. This was the world's first international collaborative clinical trial on an inactivated COVID-19 vaccine. The increasing quantity of samples and data from clinical trials carried out in various parts of the world significantly hastened the process of developing a market-ready COVID-19 vaccine. In many of these countries, national leaders personally showed the way in the vaccination campaign. However, data showed a huge gap between vaccine production and demand. As of April 2021, only 780 million COVID-19 vaccine doses had been administered globally.
We are going out for the 18 to 45 years of age.
I haven't been vaccinated.
习近平总书记从一开始就指出说，疫苗是国际公共产品。世卫组织也一直倡导，在疫苗的问题上，专利也好，产权也好，就号召大家要把这个放弃，大家一定要联合起来，不光是中国人民联合起来，全世界人民要联合起来。
In order to meet the huge demand at home and abroad, China was the first country to designate COVID-19 vaccines as global public goods. China also took the lead in giving up intellectual property rights and conducting joint production with developing countries. As of June 2022, China had transferred the relevant technology to and co-produced vaccines with more than 20 countries, creating an annual production capacity of 1 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines overseas and providing over 2.2 billion doses to more than 120 countries and international organizations.
We are sure that it is safe and also good efficacy. We are confident in that.
In China, unremitting efforts by the government and community workers ensured that the vaccination rate climbed rapidly. Protecting vulnerable groups, including the elderly, has been a major challenge. China launched a campaign to administer second booster shots on December 14, 2022. The target groups were those at high risk of infection, those over the age of 60, those with a serious underlying medical condition, and those with a weakened immune system. For people across China, ceiling strips and water-filled barricades are part of their past 3 years of shared memories. Such as in this neighborhood, home to almost 5,000 residents. Community workers used barricades to seal off 3 apartment blocks. Tianlin was in charge of community service work.
怎么了？这是又？
他要把这个违章撤掉，继续，就是我们不让他撤，就骂我的工作人员。
他要从这儿过去。
对，我们不是全封堵了吗？还不可，他非要去拆违章，他要出去。
Confrontations like this were not uncommon. Some residents at first failed to appreciate the importance of the strict community lockdown measures. Since the initial outbreak in Wuhan, early detection, early reporting, early isolation, and early treatment had become key principles for China in dealing with COVID. Anyone confirmed as infected had to be isolated and treated immediately. Blocking community transmission was a vital measure in preventing the spread of COVID-19. Community workers and volunteers were tasked with buying essential supplies for locked-down residents.
这个区小超市今天开张啊，品种大家自己看，有所需要的通过电话或者在微信平台里面来跟我们提供需求。 我就发到我的内部工作群里面，然后通过我的网格员就发到各个群里面。把这花卷也马上回来，你干脆在旁边等一下。
什么都找他，什么事情解决没吃没喝的都找他们。对啊，他们天天从过年前到现在都是在为我们那些社区的居民的工作，我们真的很感恩，很感谢，真的非常感谢你，真的辛苦了，真的不容易。真的不容易，谢谢你。你看我们什么困难都要找你们，什么吃的喝的，没有用的都要找你们。谢谢你，谢谢啊，辛苦了，辛苦了，真的他很委屈的。这个疫情是其实谁都不会想，我们作为公民就应该配合人家。他们真的很辛苦的，他没有生命安全吗？他不是父母的子女吗？对不对？你不能要求的太苛刻了，对吧？我们都应该配合人家。
Community lockdowns, PCR testing, makeshift hospitals. These measures, first tried in Wuhan, proved to be the most effective.
Wuhan 实现零新增，给了全世界希望。
从今天开始恢复汉口、武昌、武汉3大火车站始发的42条公交线路。
After 76 days, Wuhan's lockdown was over. The victory in Wuhan convinced China that the pandemic could be contained at a relatively low cost in terms of time and resources. Over the 3 years that followed, the experience gained and measures adopted in Wuhan were embraced and perfected. China, by acting promptly to adjust its prevention and control measures, has effectively protected its people's life and health. From April 2020 to March 2022, the number of COVID-19 infections in China was consistently among the lowest in the world. Rural areas have limited medical resources and relatively fewer doctors. But of the 100 clustered outbreaks in China over the past 3 years, only a few occurred in rural areas. What shielded the 500 million strong rural population? Strict prevention measures. In this small village in southwestern Yunnan province, residents are required to wear a mask, and everyone entering is screened using the Health Code app.
测下体温，叫他们登记下那个，就是自己扫下码，填下那个健康申请表给人的。
If a COVID-19 outbreak occurs nearby, villagers will be asked to stay at home, and all recreational facilities will be closed.
合作在一起，不出门个，聚会也不聚了。现在我们就家里面自己家，在那都不能。
Zhong Nanshan, a top Chinese expert on respiratory diseases, estimated that from early 2020 to December 2022, the COVID-19 death rate on the Chinese mainland was less than 1/200th of the global average, and almost 1/900th that of the United States. So, in effect, nearly 20 million lives were saved. Not only the Chinese government, but almost all the Chinese people were convinced that compared with the herd immunity policy of Western countries, an active epidemic prevention policy of targeted prevention and control and dynamic zero COVID was the most effective solution.
但是就我个人来言的话，可能没有太大的影响，除了出于安全考虑，我可能不会在外面乱溜达。
客流量是很大的，每天这边没有特别的那啥，没有太大的影响。
It's a lot better than last year. Everything get back to normal. I think not only in Beijing, I think most of the cities. We're from a different city.
Looks back to normal. It looks like there's because we're in China and not in other countries, and COVID is not really not bad right now. So it just feels like there's no problem.
Millions of community workers and volunteers, and 1.4 billion ordinary people were enthusiastically committed to the fight against the epidemic. From medical staff to couriers, from ordinary people who always did a PCR test when required, to neighbors who shared anti-epidemic supplies. Everyone believed that if they made an effort and cooperated, COVID-19 would be eradicated.
Now, scientists in South Africa are warning of a new strain of COVID-19.
Well, as we've been hearing, the World Health Organization tonight classed this latest mutation as a variant of concern, giving it the name Omicron.
中国内地首次检出了新冠病毒奥密克戎变异株，是来自天津。
浦东新区全区均为封控区或管控区，暂时没有防范区。
The emergence of the Omicron strain put China's COVID control policies under greater pressure than ever before. Studies showed Omicron infects the human body around 70 times faster than all previous COVID-19 strains, although the symptoms are much less severe.
从目前的这个统计的这个传播指数的数据来看，应该它是超过了这个麻疹病毒，应该是人类有史以来它的传播能力最强的一种呼吸道病毒。
At the end of March 2022, Shanghai was hit by a massive Omicron surge. The city, with a population of 25 million, was placed under strict quarantine, which would last for 75 days. Subsequently, frequent mass COVID testing became the new norm in China, along with increasingly strict policies for checking travel records and scanning health kits.
像大规模核酸筛查这种行程码、健康码，就是出量码，这些其实也就是这1年来这个熟悉的场景了其实，在前2年的时候，并没有像这个样子。从2020年1月10号以来我们国家就是新增本土新冠病例是0天数有250天在全指每秒钟7例这种新冠感染患者的这种情况下，这250天其实是非常不易的
Against all odds, Shanghai managed to contain Omicron. But with the onset of winter, the variant spread to other parts of China. The dynamic zero-COVID policy was coming under unprecedented pressure. People began to wonder about the differences between Omicron and previous variants.
这个疫情到2022年年底的时候，它有几个方面的变化，我们感觉是可以进一步的实行优化调整的时机了。第一个还就是病原体的它的致病力，确实是发生了明显的变化，在下降。第二一点，我们整个中国人的主动免疫的这个水平在明显的提升，像我们的疫苗的接种，特别是对老年人的一些高危人群的疫苗接种比例达到了一定的要求。
It was time for a change. On November 10th, 2022, President Xi Jinping chaired a meeting of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the CPC. It was at this meeting that the decision was taken to optimize China's COVID prevention and control measures.
就说这个病毒，我们是无法把它消灭掉的，尤其是这个奥密克戎变异株，一个人传20多人，它的这个传播力这么快，让它不感染，几乎是不可能的，全世界没有任何一个国家做到的。那么在这种情况下，我们就必须要做出一个抉择。
Following the adjustment, individuals infected by COVID-19 were no longer required to be quarantined. Terms such as close contact and risk area were no longer deemed relevant. The introduction of Class B management officially terminated the legal grounds for mass quarantine.
你如果按照中国当时那种方法的话，对吧？那也许全球它都不会再去发展的，对吧？但是它做不到这一点的时候，那我们实际上到最后也要跟它去共存。
In the 3 years of fighting the virus, China has been upgrading its medical infrastructure. In rural areas, investment in equipment and personnel has been significantly strengthened. All these efforts are geared towards guaranteeing the effective operation of the integrated medical system, in which community hospitals and township health centers play a key role. This is a suburban township in Chongqing Municipality, southwest China. This 10-month-old baby, suffering from a persistent cough, was rushed to the Wujia Town Health Center. In mid-December last year, the number of daily outpatient visits here reached a high of 340 compared to an average of 190 previously.
就只是发烧了哈，等吃了药就好了就一直就相当于有点咳。
Since December, the clinic has been constantly crowded, with many cases like this child's.
我们在农村在基层和老百姓说白了，大家都是比较熟悉了，有一种叫医患感情了，应该说是大家是熟人，好，不管大人还是娃娃，一般有时候能够现在他们去那儿，有时候把那疾病就缓解了，他们思想顾虑就没得了。
Wujia town has an elderly population of over 6,000, accounting for around 16% of all its residents.
他以前呢是个风湿性心脏病，然后今天呢从上午就在给他排床，排好了以后呢是弄过来的，让他进行接受治疗。
The hospital's inpatient wards used to have 120 beds. That number has been increased to 203. All are occupied.
你看医生，你看我那么呼吸来啥子呀？慢慢呼吸哈，你做深呼吸，要使力吸气，慢慢的吸。
This local hospital regularly receives assistance from visiting doctors. Wang Yi is a doctor from the Department of Critical Care Medicine at a large city hospital. She arrived just in time to put the ventilators to use.
因为我是 ICU 的嘛，我们科室用床估计还是很多，所以说还是会一点，也教一下大家。有些相对来说不特别重的病人，呼吸衰竭的病人就不用转到上级医院去了，我们在热级医院都可以解决。
By the end of 2021, China had almost 1 million primary-level medical and healthcare institutions nationwide, including 35,000 township health centers and nearly 600,000 village clinics. In remote mountainous areas with large ethnic populations, doctors sometimes have to cross mountains to visit their patients. 56-year-old Zhao Yuanqiang is the only doctor in this village of 1,300 people. Many of them belong to an ethnic minority with its own traditional medicine techniques. Part of Zhao's job involves gathering herbs to make treatments. Because of a recent COVID outbreak, he has been going out more often.
上班时间和下班时间是由老百姓定的，随时喊随时到。
The villagers' homes are scattered across the mountains. For the elderly residents, he makes house calls.
平時喊人冇水嚟的，但係好孤僻的喎，好負責的喎，好負責的當地。
剛才老人家2個老人家都患了有新冠的，都要恢復蠻好了。我到現在都過來看着他們，我一天都要看到都去診老人家。 都要去30或15個那樣嘅做城市裡面個轉。
There are more than 1 million village doctors in China. In the past few years, the country has succeeded in ensuring that even the remotest rural areas are served by a doctor. Since China loosened its epidemic control measures, community-level medical facilities have become vital means of support for rural residents. The prospect of hundreds of millions of people returning from the cities to their rural hometowns for Spring Festival raised the specter of a devastating second wave of COVID infections. But it never arrived.
China is the only major economy is expected to see growth this year.
It's the biggest jump in GDP since China started keeping quarterly records in 1992.
The strength and confidence comes from government spending, strong exports, and early control of the COVID-19 pandemic.
This is Zhengzhou, a city in central China. It's the site of the world's largest production base of Apple mobile phones. With 200,000 employees and 90 production lines, it turns out 130 million mobile phones, or 50% of Apple's global output every year. At no point in 2020 or 2021 was production here ever interrupted, ensuring a timely supply of phones for Apple fans around the world.
以我们这个车间为例，我们这个车间大概是2000人，整个厂区有几十个车间在满负荷的在运营，每年要为生产大约上亿只产品，来满足客户和全球各地的需求。
Throughout the pandemic, China remained a major contributor to global economic growth. In 2021, China's gross domestic product grew by 8.4%, the highest rate for a decade, surpassing both the IMF's forecast and the goal set by the Chinese government. Over the past 5 years, in spite of global instability, the pandemic, and a domestic slowdown, China still managed to achieve average GDP growth of 5% annually.
Today, we are thrilled to introduce our next generation of iPhone. Here it is.
In September 2022, Apple launched its latest model, the iPhone 14 Pro. However, people soon found it was taking longer than expected to get their new phone. The reason was that the Foxconn factory in Zhengzhou had been shut down due to the pandemic. This was just a small part of the overall impact made by the Omicron variant, which was seriously interfering with China's economic development. However, now under the new COVID policies, the Chinese economy is quickly recovering. With the help of the local government, Foxconn's production base in Zhengzhou was able to resume output at its earlier peak level within a month.
我们这个园区是负责郑州总保区里面手机生产零件的全部进口和配送作业。目前呢，每天进货量达到180车次以上，往生产车间配送呢达到240车次以上，已经达到了历史的一个峰值。
Shipments out of the factory have already reached 90% of their peak level in early 2022. The factory is staffed by a full complement of 200,000 employees, who are on duty every day, and all its production lines are running at full capacity.
目前，我们要利用这一段时间，以最短的时间和最快的速度，把我们之前失去的时间和订单追回来。目前订单量也是我们以前的最高的水平，一直到春节乃至春节后的一段时间，都是我们生产的高峰。
In 2022, China's GDP surpassed 120 trillion yuan, or 18 trillion US dollars, an increase of 3% year on year. Big companies like Foxconn are crucial to economic growth, but the millions of small businesses and private entrepreneurs are equally, if not more, important. This is a large flower distribution center in Guangzhou. He Jianlong, a 34-year-old Guangzhou native, runs a flower stall. He's making purchases for the upcoming Spring Festival flower market.
剑兰我买了，其实不够，远远不够，预算是800到900。
It's a Spring Festival custom in Guangdong Province for a family to visit the flower market, buy flowers, and then take a pre-holiday stroll.
逛花街是我们老广过年必备的一个节目，没有了这个逛花街，我没有了这个卖花，这一年我就感觉不是太完整了。
The century-old West Lake Flower Market in the old part of the city is the largest of its kind in Guangzhou. After 2 years of being closed due to the pandemic, the 3-day event has restarted. But there was widespread uncertainty about whether the flower market would continue to prosper. He Jianlong seized the opportunity to secure 2 stalls.
老大賺個開市好微嘅咋啲利潤。好，多謝晒，多謝晒，身體健康啊，身體健康。
And his gamble paid off. A sign of how good business has been is the hoarseness of his voice.
而且今年我想采购的量是特别大，比往年多了大概50%左右。现在就剩下这么一些，基本上售卖完毕。
It's Spring Festival Eve, and the West Lake Flower Market is crowded. A total of 1.5 million people visited the 400-meter-long streets in the course of 3 days.
逛花市啊，对广州人来说就是一种不可或缺的仪式感嘛。广东话就是讲就是行過花街，先算過年啊嘛。
Away from Guangzhou, such lively scenes have been repeated across the country. And one of the biggest beneficiaries of the new COVID policies is China's movie industry. People flooded to the cinemas. Box office receipts during the 7-day holiday totaled $1 billion, the second highest figure ever for a spring festival period. And travel also bounced back. In the 7 days, over 300 million passenger journeys were recorded on the country's transport network, generating revenue of $56 billion for the tourism industry, a 30% year-on-year increase. For foreign businesses in China, there is now a sense of optimism after 3 years of challenges. These videos appeared on Chinese social media platforms, including Douyin, Xiaohongshu, as well as various e-commerce websites. As part of a digital marketing strategy targeting the domestic market, they are not the work of a local business, but of Dutch entrepreneur Eric van Reenen. Van Reenen has more than 2 decades of experience in China. He runs a sourcing and trading company in Guangdong.
This market has still so much potential. There is so much growth still to come. We have seen even over the past quarters against the tide, we have been growing. And I think the response we get out of the market is so positive. It's growing, the economy is growing, so there is so much possible. So that makes China, to me, still a country that I'm very happy to be in and to do business.
Foreign direct investment in the Chinese mainland reached nearly $190 billion in 2022, a 6.3% increase over the previous year. China's new approach to dealing with COVID has also been a big boon for other countries. For investment, trade, and tourism, the world is looking to China.
I'm expecting a solid growth number for 2023. That'll be good for China. Importantly, in a world where growth will be challenged.
1/3 of the global economy was potentially likely to go into recession this year. China coming back into the economy will actually help reduce much of that pressure.
Traditionally, on Spring Festival Eve, Chinese people set off fireworks to welcome the new year. This year, the colorful fireworks assumed a special significance. They were seeing off the god of plague.
大家有没有信心？有。
刚才张总说过了，我们现在这个产线，新的一年其实产出目标是要求是比较高的。
Businesses across the country are urgently waiting to welcome back their workers. In the country's manufacturing hubs, many companies have already secured orders for the whole year ahead.
整个新能源行业，特别是我们所处的这个储能行业，订单呢应该是爆发增长。
Shoes Company, which produces energy storage battery systems, has a backlog of foreign trade orders until March 2024. The surge in orders has created a shortage of some 200 frontline workers. They're planning to visit the hometowns of potential employees even during Spring Festival, as part of a recruitment drive.
我们主要还是想招一批就是年龄合适的、稳定的一些一线的产业工人。我们23年整个一个订单呢，按照我们年前的一个排播嘛，包括我们的一个客户下订单，可能会有15倍的增长。
To help companies find the right workers, local governments have leapt into action, organizing trips to other provinces to recruit workers during Spring Festival.
贵州的200多万务工人员也带着爱心礼包，陆续登上返岗直通车，前往广东、浙江、福建、海南等地。安徽芜湖的新春招聘会吸引了357家企业报名参会。
Securing economic growth has become China's top priority. The International Monetary Fund predicts that China's economic growth will rise to 5.2% in 2023. After Spring Festival, people began to flood back to work.
我国首条跨海高铁福厦高铁建设也进入了冲刺阶段。春节后的第一个工作日，3000多名建设者在大连；春节过后的首个工作日，有23个新项目同步开工。
Guangzhou South Railway Station recorded the highest number of arrivals in its history. Between January 22nd and February 1st, China's railway system handled 102 million passengers, a near 50% increase year on year.
然后现在是左边是完全是吸收了，对不对？哎，那个。
Meanwhile, Wu Jianfeng is on late night duty at the ICU as usual. Infections are likely to continue. For China's medical workers, after 3 years, the fight against the pandemic is still ongoing.
疲惫感，对，这是很正常的呀，因为我们最终要走到这一步，因为这个病，对吧？到最后它不可能是全社会去承担，它就是一种疾病嘛，而且这个重症率又这么低。这样呢，把这个压力呢就可以转到放到这个医院这个层面，因为你做这一行，你就必须要做这样的事情，你必须要为社会承担这样的责任。一个是人类共同体的问题，对吧？新冠这一次似乎在慢慢的走向平稳，但是你谁搞不清楚它未来会不会有。好像我觉得很多专家也这样预测，病毒将是我们人类最大的一个挑战，希望就是形成一个共同的合力来去解决这样的一个疾患的，我想以后如果真的有发生这种情况的话，我们也希望这样的机制能够继续能够维持下来，我们能够集中力量共同去攻克它，解决它。